Hey guys, what made 1950s church life so powerful for many women was not only what happened on Sunday, but how easily a religious routine could stretch into the rest of the week, shaping clothing, friendships, courtship, marriage, motherhood, and even the tone of a woman's private thoughts. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like me to cover next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if calm, quietly fascinating history is your kind of evening company, subscribing is a good way to find more of it. To understand why churches in the 1950s could hold such a steady influence over women's lives, it helps to begin with something modern viewers often miss. Control did not always look like force. Very often it looked like praise. It looked like respectability, moral protection, community approval, and the promise of being seen as good. That was part of what made it so effective. In much of the English-speaking and Christian-influenced West after the Second World War, church life often offered women belonging, dignity, responsibility, and a public identity that seemed honorable. But the same structure that offered meaning could also narrow the acceptable shape of a woman's life with remarkable precision. The 1950s are often remembered through a polished surface. Neat suburban streets, pressed dresses, polished shoes, family dinners, and a culture that seemed certain of itself. In popular memory, religion sits inside that picture as a gentle background presence, a comforting moral soundtrack to domestic life. Yet for many women, church was not merely background. It was one of the institutions that translated broad cultural expectations into daily habits. It gave language to duty. It gave ceremony to obedience. It gave social reward to conformity. And because it often seemed benevolent, it could reach very deeply without always appearing harsh. This did not happen in exactly the same way everywhere. A Catholic parish in one town, a Southern Baptist congregation in another, a Mormon ward, an Anglican parish, a Pentecostal church, a Lutheran congregation, or a conservative evangelical fellowship could all create somewhat different experiences. Class, race, region, denomination, and urban or rural life all mattered. The life of a black churchwoman in the United States, for example, could involve forms of leadership, strength, and community labor that do not fit neatly into the simple stereotype of passive domesticity. In some settings, churches also provided women with real influence, educational work, charity networks, and a voice within local life that other institutions denied them. So the story is not that every church was identical, or that every woman experienced religion as simple oppression. But the broader pattern is still hard to miss. Across many communities, women were taught that their highest calling was to support order rather than disrupt it, to embody purity rather than ambition, to stabilize the home rather than pursue an independent public self. Churches did not invent all of those ideas on their own. They inherited them from older traditions, reinforced them through sermons and women's groups, and merged them with post-war anxieties about family, sexuality, and social change. The result was a system in which religion and culture strengthened each other. A woman was not merely told what to do by one institution. She heard similar messages from the minister, the neighborhood, the school, women's magazines, advertisers, and often from members of her own family. That overlap is important because it explains why church authority could feel less like an outside imposition and more like common sense. If a young woman was told that modesty protected her dignity, that marriage gave proper shape to adulthood, that motherhood fulfilled her nature, and that visible self-sacrifice was one of the marks of feminine virtue, those ideas did not arrive as isolated rules. They came woven into a whole moral world. A respectable girl was expected to avoid looking too bold, too opinionated, too intellectually threatening, too sexually visible, or too eager for a life outside the boundaries approved for her. Church did not have to punish every deviation directly. Often it only had to help define what counted as normal. And normality in the 1950s carried enormous weight. In a decade shaped by Cold War tension, memories of depression and war, and a strong cultural hunger for stability, institutions that promised moral clarity gained unusual power. For many families, church represented continuity in a world that had recently endured enormous disruption. Men had gone to war, economies had been shaken, gender roles had shifted during wartime labor and then were being reasserted afterward. The home became, in public rhetoric, a kind of moral fortress. The family was presented as the basic defense against social disorder, political danger, sexual looseness, and spiritual decline. In that world, women were often cast as the guardians of the fortress, but only on the condition that they accepted a supervised version of power. This is one of the quiet contradictions at the center of the story. Women were often told they were morally central, spiritually influential, and indispensable to the health of the family. That sounds empowering at first, but the form of that importance was carefully limited. A woman was praised as the heart of the home, while being discouraged from becoming too visible beyond it. She was described as spiritually significant, while formal authority often remained in male hands. She was entrusted with raising children in the faith, maintaining the household's moral tone, organizing meals, holidays, and church participation, and presenting the family as decent and disciplined. Yet she was also reminded, directly or indirectly, that leadership, doctrine, final judgment, and public voice belonged elsewhere. In practice, this meant that many women worked constantly under a moral gaze. Some of that gaze came from men in authority, ministers, priests, elders, deacons, fathers, husbands. But much of it also came from other women. Older women corrected younger ones. Mothers taught daughters how to sit, speak, dress, and date. Church ladies noticed hems, hair, lipstick, company, attendance, and reputation. None of this required an official tribunal. It worked through observation, memory, and conversation. A woman's life could be narrowed by hundreds of small signals before any formal rebuke was ever needed. Even ordinary church participation carried expectations beyond worship itself. There were women's auxiliaries, Bible circles, charity committees, Sunday school work, choir duties, church dinners, sewing efforts, visiting ministries, nursery responsibilities, and seasonal events. On the surface, these spaces gave women fellowship and purpose, and often they genuinely did. Many women built lasting friendships there. They found relief from isolation, shared practical advice, exchanged recipes and childcare help, and created local networks of care. But these organizations also reinforced a particular definition of feminine usefulness. Women could be active, certainly, but their activity was expected to be nurturing, supportive, orderly, and service-oriented. Leadership was often acceptable so long as it remained inside approved female channels. That distinction mattered enormously. A woman could organize a fundraiser, decorate a fellowship hall, teach children, prepare food for dozens of people, coordinate charity for a struggling family, and become indispensable to the life of the congregation. Yet this labor did not necessarily translate into authority over doctrine, preaching, finance, or the broader direction of church life. In other words, women were often allowed, even expected, to sustain the institution while being reminded that they did not quite govern it. The church relied on their effort and restricted their reach at the same time. And because this work was framed as service, it often became spiritually difficult to question. To resist could feel selfish. To ask why women always prepared the meal while men spoke at the meeting could sound petty in a culture that treated sacrifice as beauty. To resent the endless expectation of cheerfulness and availability could seem like a failure of gratitude. The most effective systems of control are often the ones that persuade people that compliance is virtue. In many 1950s religious communities, that persuasion operated gently, repeatedly, and with enormous social force. It also extended into appearance. Clothing was not just fabric. It was moral language. A respectable church-going woman was expected to look neat but not vain, attractive but not provocative, feminine but not flamboyant. The exact standards varied, but the general pressure was clear. Dresses, gloves, hats in some communities, careful grooming, and an overall polished modesty signaled not merely personal taste but character. A woman's body became something to manage for the comfort of a moral community. Too plain could suggest neglect. Too glamorous could suggest danger. Even beauty had to be disciplined. This was especially true for younger women. Courtship and sexuality sat close to the center of church concern, because they sat close to the center of family concern. A daughter's reputation could affect not only her own future but her family's standing. Advice about purity, virtue, self-control, and proper female behavior was often delivered with a mixture of tenderness and warning. A girl was taught that desire, especially male desire, was a force she had to help regulate. Her clothing, speech, posture, and social choices could all be interpreted as moral signals. This placed a heavy burden on young women because responsibility for communal standards often settled most firmly on the person with the least formal power. There was another irony here as well. The same religious culture that praised innocence often required girls and women to become highly skilled readers of risk. They had to know how to avoid gossip, manage impressions, refuse certain invitations without appearing rude, attract the right kind of attention without attracting the wrong kind, and protect themselves from judgment in a world that could be unforgiving. The ideal was simplicity. The reality often required careful calculation. Marriage, of course, sat near the center of the whole arrangement. In many churches, marriage was not simply one possible future among others. It was the expected path into full adult respectability. A single woman might be loved, useful, admired even, but she was still often seen as unfinished, waiting, or somehow outside the preferred design. Once married, her religious identity often fused more tightly with domestic duty. She was expected to support her husband's moral life, stabilize his home, bear and raise children, manage hospitality, and create an atmosphere in which faith seemed natural. Religion here was not just belief. It was choreography. It assigned gestures, rhythms, responsibilities, silences. And yet many women accepted, defended, and even cherished this world. That is important to say clearly. Historical understanding becomes shallow when it treats the past only as a prison and never as a source of meaning. For many women, church life brought beauty, rhythm, belonging, dignity, music, prayer, friendship, and a structure that helped make suffering bearable. Some women found real purpose in religious service. Some used church spaces to build influence subtly, to help neighbors, to educate children, to protect families, or to carve out authority in forms their society would allow. Some sincerely believed these gender roles reflected divine order and experienced them not as punishment but as vocation. But sincerity does not erase structure. A system can feel meaningful and still be restrictive. It can offer comfort and also demand submission. It can praise women and also contain them. That tension, more than any easy slogan, is what makes the 1950s church world worth lingering over. Because once we move past the polished image of post-war respectability, we begin to see how power worked best when it spoke softly, smiled warmly, and called limitation by gentler names. And the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that church control was not only about belief or attendance. It touched education, marriage choices, reproductive expectations, household labor, emotional discipline, and the very idea of what a good woman was allowed to want. Which is where the story starts to widen, because the next layer is not just how women behaved inside church, but how church logic followed them home, into the kitchen, the bedroom, the nursery, and the private corners of daily life where approval could no longer be separated from identity. Which is where the story starts to widen, because the next layer is not just how women behaved inside church, but how church logic followed them home, into the kitchen, the bedroom, the nursery, and the private corners of daily life where approval could no longer be separated from identity. In many households, the boundary between religious instruction and ordinary routine was almost invisible. A woman did not simply attend church. She carried its expectations into the quiet structure of her day. Morning began not only with practical tasks but often with a sense of moral accounting. Was the house orderly enough to reflect discipline? Were the children being raised with the right tone of obedience and reverence? Was the husband being supported in a way that affirmed his authority rather than complicated it? These were not always spoken as formal rules, yet they were understood as part of a moral rhythm that extended far beyond Sunday. One of the most subtle ways this influence operated was through the idea of responsibility for atmosphere. A good woman was often described not just as someone who completed tasks, but as someone who created a feeling calm, controlled, respectable, and morally upright. The home itself became a kind of small stage on which faith was expected to appear natural. Cleanliness was not only about hygiene but about order. Quietness was not only about peace but about discipline. Even small disruptions, a child speaking out of turn, a meal served late, a visible moment of frustration, could feel like minor failures in a much larger moral performance. This expectation could become particularly intense because it was often internalized. External correction existed, certainly, but over time many women learned to monitor themselves. The question was no longer simply what others might say, but what one ought to feel. A moment of impatience might bring not just embarrassment, but guilt. A desire for rest might be weighed against the idea of duty. A wish for something beyond the home might be quietly examined, sometimes dismissed, sometimes reshaped into something more acceptable. In this way, control did not require constant supervision. It was sustained by a cultivated inner voice that aligned closely with what the community already approved. Yet this inner discipline was rarely presented as control. It was described in gentler language: devotion, faithfulness, humility, care. These words carried a genuine emotional appeal. They suggested not restriction but purpose. They offered a way to understand everyday labor as something elevated, something connected to a larger moral order. Cooking a meal, folding laundry, tending to a sick child, these could be framed as acts of quiet spiritual significance. For many women, this framing made demanding routines feel meaningful, even when they were exhausting. At the same time, it also set limits on what kinds of dissatisfaction could be expressed. If the home was treated as a sacred space, then frustration within it could feel almost like a personal failing. If sacrifice was praised as virtue, then wanting less sacrifice could appear selfish. This did not mean that women never complained or never resisted. They did, often in private conversations, in subtle choices, in the ways they raised their daughters, or in the quiet negotiation of household power. But the language available to describe dissatisfaction was often narrow. It had to fit within a system that valued harmony over disruption. The relationship between husband and wife reflected these patterns in particularly visible ways. Many churches emphasized a structure in which the husband was described as the head of the household, responsible for guidance and final decisions, while the wife was encouraged to support, respect, and maintain unity. This model was often presented as both natural and divinely ordered. For some couples, it worked in flexible, negotiated ways. For others, it created a more rigid hierarchy that shaped everything from financial decisions to social interactions. What is often overlooked is how much emotional labor this arrangement required from women. Maintaining harmony was not a passive task. It involved anticipating moods, smoothing over disagreements, adjusting tone, and sometimes absorbing tension without outward complaint. A woman might be expected to disagree carefully, to correct gently, to influence indirectly. Direct confrontation could be interpreted as disrespect, while silence could become a form of quiet endurance. Over time, this produced a form of expertise, an ability to manage relationships with precision, but often at the cost of suppressing more direct forms of expression. Children, too, became part of this extended moral structure. A mother was not only responsible for their physical care, but for shaping their character in ways that reflected well on both the family and the church. Discipline was not just about behavior. It was about forming obedience, respect, and moral awareness. A child's actions in public spaces, including church gatherings, could reflect directly on the mother's success or failure. This created a constant background pressure, one that could make even small moments feel significant. Education reinforced these patterns. In many communities, girls were subtly guided toward futures that aligned with domestic and supportive roles. Even when formal schooling expanded, the underlying message often remained consistent. Ambition was acceptable, but it should not interfere with the expected path of marriage and motherhood. Churches, youth groups, and social events helped shape these expectations early. A girl learned not only what was possible, but what was preferred, admired, and rewarded. Courtship, as a result, was rarely a purely personal matter. It unfolded under observation, both gentle and direct. A young woman's choice of partner could be discussed, advised upon, sometimes quietly evaluated by older members of the community. The qualities she was encouraged to seek, stability, faith, respectability, aligned closely with the broader social ideal. At the same time, she was expected to present herself as desirable in a controlled way, balancing attraction with restraint. This delicate balance required constant adjustment, and mistakes could carry long-lasting reputational consequences. Even moments that appeared private were often shaped by shared expectations. Intimacy within marriage, for example, was not always openly discussed, but it was still framed by religious teaching. A woman might be encouraged to see her role as one of support and responsiveness, while her own desires were less frequently explored or acknowledged. The language surrounding these topics was often indirect, leaving much to interpretation and placing additional pressure on women to navigate expectations without clear guidance. At the same time, it is important to recognize that many women develop strategies within these constraints. They formed close friendships that allowed for more honest conversation. They exchanged advice in ways that softened rigid expectations. They used humor, discretion, and shared understanding to create small spaces of autonomy. These informal networks could be powerful, even if they remained largely invisible to formal authority. This creates another quiet contradiction. While the official structure emphasized order and hierarchy, the lived experience often depended on negotiation and adaptation. Women learned where rules could bend slightly, where silence could be used strategically, where influence could be exercised indirectly. In some cases, this allowed them to shape outcomes more than the formal structure would suggest. But it also meant that much of their power remained unrecognized, existing in a kind of shadow space rather than in open acknowledgement. As the 1950s progressed, these patterns did not remain entirely stable. Subtle shifts began to appear, sometimes almost unnoticed at first. Economic changes, the expansion of education, the slow movement of ideas across media, and the experiences of women who had worked during the war all contributed to a quiet questioning. Not always openly, not always in direct opposition, but in small adjustments to expectation. A woman might pursue a bit more education than her mother had. She might delay marriage slightly. She might interpret her role with a little more flexibility. Churches responded to these changes in different ways. Some reinforced traditional structures more firmly, emphasizing clarity and continuity. Others began to adapt, allowing for new forms of participation, new conversations about women's roles, and a gradual rethinking of what responsibility and authority could look like. These shifts were often slow, uneven, and sometimes contested, but they marked the beginning of a transition that would become more visible in the decades that followed. What makes this moment particularly interesting is how much of the change began quietly. There were no sudden declarations in most communities, no clear moment when everything shifted. Instead, there were conversations, hesitations, small decisions made in kitchens and church halls, adjustments in how rules were interpreted, and a growing awareness that the boundaries of women's lives might not be as fixed as they had once seemed. And as these small changes accumulated, they began to create a new kind of tension, one that was not yet fully visible, but was already reshaping the expectations that churches had long treated as stable, setting the stage for questions that would soon become harder to contain. And as these small changes accumulated, they began to create a new kind of tension, one that was not yet fully visible, but was already reshaping the expectations that churches had long treated as stable, setting the stage for questions that would soon become harder to contain. At first, those questions rarely appeared as open challenges. They showed themselves instead in hesitation, pause before agreeing, a quiet reconsideration of advice that once felt unquestionable, a sense, sometimes difficult to name, that the language of duty no longer explained everything a woman felt about her own life. Because for many women in the late 1950s, the world was beginning to offer glimpses of alternatives, not always dramatic ones, but enough to create comparison. Media played a subtle role here. Magazines, radio programs, and the growing influence of television carried images of womanhood that did not always align perfectly with church-centered expectations. Even when these images still emphasized domestic life, they sometimes introduced new tones, individual satisfaction, personal fulfillment, a slightly more visible sense of self. A woman might still be shown as a wife and mother, but also as someone with preferences, opinions, and a kind of interior life that extended beyond service. This did not immediately dismantle existing structures. In many cases, it simply layered new expectations on top of old ones. A woman was now encouraged not only to be devoted, but also to appear content. Not only to fulfill her role, but to feel fulfilled by it. That distinction may seem small, but it carried real pressure. It asked women to manage not just their behavior, but their emotional presentation. Dissatisfaction, when it appeared, became more difficult to express, because it could be interpreted not just as a personal struggle, but as a failure to appreciate what one had been given. Within church communities, this created a delicate balancing act. Ministers and leaders often continued to emphasize traditional roles, but they did so in a context where some women were beginning to experience those roles differently. Sermons about obedience and order still resonated, but they also had to coexist with a slowly shifting cultural language that spoke, however cautiously, about individuality. One of the more subtle shifts appeared in the way women engaged with religious teaching itself. Earlier patterns had often encouraged acceptance and repetition, learning doctrine, applying it faithfully, passing it on. But as educational opportunities expanded, even modestly, some women began to engage more analytically. They read more widely. They asked questions, sometimes privately, about interpretation. They compared teachings across denominations or between generations. This did not always lead to visible disagreement, but it did introduce a new kind of internal dialogue. An internal dialogue, once established, has a way of deepening over time. In some households, this could take the form of quiet negotiation. A woman might continue to fulfill expected roles while adjusting their meaning slightly. She might place a bit more emphasis on her own judgment in raising children, or allow herself small decisions that were not entirely guided by external expectation. These changes were often so gradual that they did not appear as rebellion. They appeared as personality, as variation, as individual style within an accepted framework. But even these small variations could accumulate into something more significant, because the system that had once felt seamless depended on consistency. It depended on the idea that most people, most of the time, would reinforce the same values in similar ways. Once that consistency began to loosen, even slightly, it introduced unpredictability. A younger woman might notice that her friend's household operated differently. A conversation in a church group might reveal that not everyone interpreted a rule in the same way. A mother might realize that her daughter was growing up in a world that no longer mirrored her own exactly. These moments did not immediately overturn authority, but they changed its texture. Authority became something that could be considered, rather than simply inherited. At the same time, generational differences began to sharpen. Women who had come of age earlier, particularly before or during the war, often carried a stronger attachment to established patterns. For them, stability was not an abstract value. It was something earned through hardship. Younger women, especially those reaching adulthood in the late 1950s, had grown up in a slightly different environment. They had experienced more consistent prosperity, more exposure to media, and in some cases more education. Their expectations were not identical, even if they lived within the same communities. This created quiet friction, not open conflict, but a sense that advice which once felt definitive now required interpretation. A daughter might respect her mother's guidance while also sensing that it did not fully account for her own circumstances. A church leader might notice that younger members responded differently to the same message. Again, none of this needed to be dramatic to be significant. It simply needed to exist. Another important shift came from the way women's work was being perceived. During the war years, many women had taken on roles outside the home out of necessity. After the war, there was strong cultural pressure to return to domestic life, and many did. But the memory of that earlier experience did not entirely disappear. It remained as a reference point, a quiet reminder that capability extended beyond the boundaries currently being emphasized. Church teaching often responded by reaffirming the value of the home, sometimes more strongly than before. Domestic life was described not as a fallback, but as a primary calling. This language was persuasive, and for many women it resonated deeply. But it also had to compete, increasingly, with the lived awareness that alternatives existed. Even if those alternatives were not widely pursued, their presence altered the sense of what was possible. In some congregations, this led to a subtle expansion of acceptable roles. Women might take on slightly more visible positions within church activities, organize larger events, or engage in forms of outreach that extended beyond traditional boundaries. These changes were often framed carefully, so as not to appear disruptive. They were presented as natural extensions of existing responsibilities rather than departures from them. But framing can only go so far. When the scope of activity changes, the underlying assumptions are eventually touched. Perhaps one of the most revealing areas where this tension surfaced was in conversations about calling and purpose. Traditionally, a woman's purpose had been described in terms closely tied to family and support. As new influences entered the cultural landscape, some women began to articulate a broader sense of vocation. This did not always mean rejecting family life, but it did mean imagining it as part of a larger identity rather than its entirety. These ideas did not spread evenly, and they were not always welcomed. In some communities, they were gently redirected back toward familiar language. In others, they were met with more direct resistance. But once the question of purpose had been expanded, even slightly, it became difficult to reduce again. And so the church, which had long functioned as a stabilizing force, found itself in a more complex position. It was still a center of community, still a source of moral language, still a place where many women found meaning and connection. But it was also now a space where subtle differences in interpretation could exist side by side, sometimes comfortably, sometimes not. What is striking is how often this transformation remained quiet. There were no immediate breaks, no clear turning points that everyone recognized at the time. Instead, there was a gradual thickening of experience. The same sermon could be heard in slightly different ways. The same expectation could be fulfilled with slightly different intentions. The same role could be inhabited with a slightly expanded sense of self. And it is in these small differences that larger changes often begin. Because once a system relies not only on obedience, but on interpretation, it becomes more difficult to maintain a single, unified direction. Individuals begin to carry their own variations of the shared structure. Over time, those variations can align, diverge, or quietly reshape the whole. By the end of the decade, these undercurrents were becoming more noticeable, even if they were not yet fully acknowledged. Conversations lingered a little longer. Questions remained open a little more often. The certainty that had once defined so much of church life was still present, but it was no longer entirely unchallenged from within. And as the cultural landscape continued to shift through education, media, economic change, and the slow movement of ideas, those internal questions would begin to intersect with broader movements that were already forming just beyond the edges of church life. Movements that would soon bring a new level of visibility to tensions that had, until then, been largely contained within the quiet structure of everyday faith. And as the cultural landscape continued to shift through education, media, economic change, and the slow movement of ideas, those internal questions would begin to intersect with broader movements that were already forming just beyond the edges of church life, movements that would soon bring a new level of visibility to tensions that had, until then, been largely contained within the quiet structure of everyday faith. At first, this intersection was not announced with any clear boundary. It did not feel like two separate worlds colliding, but rather like something already present within church life gradually becoming more visible. A woman who had once questioned her role privately might now encounter language, however tentative, that seemed to echo her thoughts. A conversation that would have remained confined to a kitchen table might now appear, in softened form, in a magazine article or a radio discussion. These connections did not immediately resolve uncertainty, but they made it harder to dismiss. Within many congregations, this created a subtle shift in tone. Sermons that had once relied on confident repetition of established ideas began, in some places, to include more careful phrasing. The language of certainty remained, but it was sometimes accompanied by an awareness that listeners were no longer entirely uniform in their assumptions. A minister might still speak about order and family roles, but now with an added emphasis on understanding, or with a slight acknowledgement that the world outside the church was becoming more complex. For women, this could feel like standing in two overlapping realities. On one hand, the familiar structure remained intact. The expectations of modesty, devotion, and domestic responsibility were still present, still reinforced through habit and community. On the other hand, there was an emerging sense that these expectations were not as fixed as they had once appeared. The result was not immediate change, but a kind of quiet doubling of awareness. This doubling could be seen most clearly in the way women spoke to one another. Conversations that had once been straightforward, reinforcing shared norms, began to include small moments of reflection. A comment might be followed by a pause, as if both speakers were considering its limits. Advice might be given with a tone that suggested flexibility rather than certainty. Even agreement could carry a subtle sense of qualification, as though it existed alongside an unspoken awareness of alternatives. It is important not to imagine these conversations as overtly confrontational. They were often careful, even restrained. Many women had a deep investment in the stability of their communities, and few wished to disrupt relationships that mattered to them. Instead, change moved through nuance, a shift in emphasis, a rewording of expectation, a willingness to leave certain questions open rather than closing them quickly. At the same time, institutional structures were not unaware of these developments. Churches had long experience in maintaining continuity, and many responded by reinforcing the clarity of their teachings. Educational materials, sermons, and women's programs often returned to core themes with renewed focus. The ideal of the devoted wife and mother was restated, sometimes with greater detail, sometimes with a more explicit connection to broader social concerns. This response reveals another layer of the story. For church leaders, the issue was not only about individual behavior but about the preservation of a moral framework that was seen as essential to the health of society. The family, as they understood it, was not simply a private arrangement. It was a structure that supported community stability, religious continuity, and social order. Changes in women's roles were therefore interpreted not only as personal choices but as shifts that could affect the entire system. From this perspective, the emphasis on traditional roles was not always experienced as control, but as protection. Protection of children from moral confusion, protection of marriages from instability, protection of communities from fragmentation. This language had real persuasive power, particularly in a period marked by broader anxieties about cultural change. It allowed existing expectations to be framed not as limitations, but as safeguards. Yet protection, when applied broadly, can also limit movement. And for women who were beginning to feel the edges of those limits, the language of protection could become more complicated. It could feel reassuring in one moment and constraining in another. A teaching that emphasized stability might also discourage exploration. A message about moral clarity might leave less room for ambiguity or personal variation. This tension became especially visible in the realm of education and intellectual life. As more women pursued higher education, even in modest numbers, they encountered new frameworks for understanding society, history, and human behavior. These frameworks did not always align neatly with the interpretations they had grown up with. The result was not necessarily rejection, but a layering of perspectives. A woman might continue to participate fully in church life while also holding questions that did not easily fit within its established categories. Some churches responded by encouraging a deeper engagement with religious study, offering Bible classes, discussion groups, and reading materials that aimed to strengthen understanding. In many cases, these efforts were sincere and thoughtful, designed to provide women with a richer sense of their faith. But they also highlighted an underlying assumption that increased knowledge would reinforce, rather than challenge, existing roles. In practice, the outcome was not always so predictable, because once a person becomes accustomed to examining ideas more closely, the act of questioning itself becomes more natural. A passage might be read in a slightly different way. A teaching might be considered in light of historical context. A practice might be evaluated not only for its tradition but for its present impact. These forms of reflection did not always lead to disagreement, but they did introduce a new level of engagement that was not entirely passive. At the same time, economic realities were beginning to exert their own influence. While the ideal of the single-income household remained strong in many communities, the practical demands of life sometimes required adjustments. Some women took on part-time work, whether out of necessity or choice. Others contributed to family income in less visible ways. Each of these decisions, however small, required negotiation with existing expectations. Church communities often adapted to these changes in pragmatic ways. A woman who worked might still be expected to maintain her domestic responsibilities, but allowances could be made in terms of scheduling or participation. The language of flexibility began to appear, though often without a full rethinking of underlying roles. In this way, the system stretched without entirely reshaping itself. This stretching created new forms of strain. A woman balancing work, home, and church responsibilities might find herself carrying a heavier load than previous generations, without a corresponding shift in recognition or authority. The expectation of cheerful devotion remained, even as the demands increased. Managing this balance required not only practical skill but emotional endurance. It is in these moments of strain that deeper questions often emerge. A woman might begin to ask, quietly, whether the distribution of responsibility was as natural as it had been presented. She might notice that her contributions, though essential, were often taken for granted. She might wonder why certain forms of work were visible and valued, while others remained largely unacknowledged. These questions did not always lead to immediate change, but they altered the way experience was understood. At the same time, not all women experienced these pressures in the same way. Class differences could shape expectations significantly. A middle-class suburban household might operate under one set of assumptions, while a working-class family faced different practical realities. Racial and cultural contexts added further layers of complexity, influencing both church structure and the lived experience of its members. These variations remind us that there was no single, uniform experience of church life in the 1950s, even as certain patterns remained widely shared. Still, across these differences, a common thread can be traced: the gradual movement from unquestioned acceptance toward a more reflective engagement with established roles. This movement was not always linear, could advance in one area while remaining unchanged in another. It could appear in one generation and be resisted in the next. But it introduced a dynamic that would continue to develop. By the closing years of the decade, the sense of quiet stability that had defined much of 1950s church life was beginning to carry a new undertone. The routines were still there. The expectations were still widely recognized. But beneath them, there was a growing awareness that they were being interpreted, adapted, and, in some cases, gently reconsidered. And as the next decade approached, this awareness would begin to connect more directly with wider social conversations about gender, authority, education, and personal identity. Conversations that would not remain at the edges for long, but would move steadily inward into the very spaces where church life had once seemed most certain. And as the next decade approached, this awareness would begin to connect more directly with wider social conversations about gender, authority, education, and personal identity. Conversations that would not remain at the edges for long, but would move steadily inward into the very spaces where church life had once seemed most certain. At first, that movement inward was almost imperceptible. It did not arrive as a clear argument or a unified set of demands. It appeared instead as a shift in the kinds of questions women felt able to hold in their minds at the same time. A woman could attend church, fulfill her responsibilities, and still carry a quiet sense that something about the structure deserved closer examination. This coexistence, faith and questioning, participation and reflection, became one of the defining features of the transition. What made this moment particularly complex was that the church itself often encouraged introspection. Women were taught to examine their motives, to reflect on their conduct, to cultivate an inner life shaped by prayer and self-awareness. These practices, intended to deepen devotion, also created a habit of careful thought. And once that habit extended beyond strictly spiritual matters, it began to touch the broader framework of daily life. For example, a woman might reflect not only on whether she had been patient or kind, but on why certain expectations seemed to apply to her more than to others. She might notice that moral language was often directed differently toward men and women, even when both were part of the same household. She might begin to distinguish between what felt genuinely meaningful and what felt simply required. these distinctions did not necessarily lead to rejection. In many cases, they led to reinterpretation. A woman might continue to embrace the value of care and responsibility, but redefine what those values looked like in practice. She might place greater emphasis on mutual respect within marriage, rather than a strictly hierarchical model. She might approach motherhood with a slightly different balance of authority and independence. These adjustments were often subtle, but they marked a shift from passive acceptance toward active shaping. Church communities, in turn, became places where these shifts could either be absorbed or resisted. In some congregations, there was room for a quiet broadening of roles. Women's groups might begin to include more discussion-based activities, where experiences could be shared rather than simply directed. Educational programs might encourage a deeper engagement with Scripture that allowed for interpretation, not just memorization. In these environments, change could unfold without open conflict, gradually reshaping expectations from within. In other settings, the response was more cautious. Leaders might emphasize continuity more strongly, reaffirming established roles with renewed clarity. The language of order, obedience, and divine design could become more pronounced, especially when there was a sense that those ideas were being questioned. This did not necessarily create open opposition, but it did highlight the boundaries more clearly. It is in this contrast that another layer of the story emerges. The same institution could function both as a source of stability and as a site of tension, depending on how its teachings were interpreted and applied. For some women, church remained a place of reassurance, where familiar patterns provided comfort in a changing world. For others, it became a space where internal questions were sharpened, even if they were not yet spoken aloud. Daily routines continued, but they carried a slightly different weight. Preparing meals, organizing the home, participating in church activities, these actions were still performed, often with the same care and attention. But the meaning attached to them could shift. What had once been experienced as unquestioned duty might now be seen as a choice, or at least as something that could be thought about differently. This shift in perception is easy to overlook, because outward behavior often remained the same. A woman might still host gatherings, attend services, and fulfill her expected roles with outward consistency. Yet internally, she might be interpreting those actions in a new way. The difference was not always visible, but it was real. One of the more telling areas where this internal shift appeared was in the way women thought about time. In earlier patterns, time was often structured around the needs of the household and the rhythms of church life. Personal time, if it existed, was secondary. As new ideas circulated, even quietly, some women began to consider the possibility that their time might have multiple dimensions. There could be time for family, time for community, and perhaps, cautiously, time for personal development. This did not mean abandoning existing responsibilities. Rather, it introduced the idea that those responsibilities might be balanced differently. A woman might set aside time for reading, for study, for reflection that was not directly tied to her immediate duties. These small acts could feel significant, not because they disrupted the household, but because they expanded the sense of what a life could include. At the same time, the language used within churches began, in some places, to adapt in subtle ways. Discussions about women's roles might include references to their contributions beyond the home, even if those contributions were still framed carefully. The idea of partnership within marriage might be expressed with slightly more emphasis, though often without fully abandoning traditional structures. These shifts were rarely dramatic, but they indicated an awareness that the conversation itself was evolving. Another important development was the growing visibility of women who did not fit neatly into the expected pattern. Single women, widows, and those whose lives did not center entirely on domestic roles became more noticeable within church communities. Their presence required a certain adjustment in language and expectation. They could not be fully described by the existing framework, and so the framework itself had to stretch, even if only slightly. This stretching often revealed the limits of earlier assumptions. It became harder to present one model of womanhood as universally applicable when real lives demonstrated a wider range of experiences. Churches responded in different ways, sometimes by creating new categories, sometimes by reinterpreting existing ones, but the underlying effect was a gradual expansion of what could be acknowledged. Even so, the pace of change remained measured. There were no sudden transformations in most communities. The process was gradual, layered, and often uneven. Some areas moved more quickly than others. Some individuals embraced new ideas more readily, while others held firmly to established patterns. The result was a landscape in which multiple understandings coexisted, sometimes comfortably, sometimes in quiet tension. What is striking, looking closely at this period, is how much of the transformation depended on ordinary moments. A conversation after a church meeting, a decision about how to raise a child, a choice to pursue a small opportunity for learning, a reflection during a quiet evening. These moments did not appear dramatic, but they carried the potential to reshape expectations over time. And as these ordinary moments accumulated, they began to influence not only individual lives, but the collective atmosphere of church communities. The sense of what was possible, what was acceptable, and what could be imagined slowly expanded, even if the language used to describe it lagged behind. By the time the early 1960s began to take shape, the groundwork for more visible change had already been laid in these quiet ways. The questions that had once been private were becoming slightly easier to share. The distinctions that had once been internal were beginning to appear in conversation. The structures that had once seemed fixed were being experienced, if only faintly, as open to interpretation. And as those changes continued to unfold, they would begin to interact more directly with broader movements that were gaining momentum beyond the walls of the church, movements that would not only ask new questions about women's lives, but would also challenge the very frameworks through which those lives had long been understood. And as those changes continued to unfold, they would begin to interact more directly with broader movements that were gaining momentum beyond the walls of the church, movements that would not only ask new questions about women's lives, but would also challenge the very frameworks through which those lives had long been understood. What made this next stage particularly delicate was that, for many women, the church was not something external that could simply be set aside. It was woven into family memory, personal identity, and daily rhythm. So when broader cultural conversations about women's roles began to sharpen, they did not arrive as abstract debates. They arrived as questions that touched relationships, beliefs, and the meaning of a life already in progress. In the early 1960s, these conversations often appeared in careful, moderated forms. Articles, books, and public discussions began to explore the idea that women's experiences within domestic life were more complex than the idealized image suggested. They spoke, sometimes cautiously, about dissatisfaction that did not stem from failure, but from a mismatch between expectation and lived reality. For women who had already begun to reflect quietly on their own circumstances, this language could feel both unsettling and clarifying at the same time. Inside church communities, the response to these emerging ideas was not uniform. Some leaders addressed them directly, framing them as misunderstandings of a divinely ordered system. Others acknowledged that women's experiences were changing and attempted to incorporate those changes into existing teachings without fully altering the structure. Still others avoided the topic altogether, maintaining a focus on continuity in the hope that broader cultural shifts would pass without fundamentally altering the life of the congregation. For many women, this created a layered experience of listening. A sermon might emphasize the enduring value of traditional roles, while an article read later in the week might suggest that those roles could be reinterpreted. A conversation with a friend might introduce yet another perspective, shaped by her own circumstances. The result was not a simple choice between opposing views, but a gradual process of sorting, weighing, and integrating different strands of thought. This process often unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly. A woman might begin by adjusting the way she understood a single expectation. She might reconsider how authority functioned within her marriage, or how she approached her children's education, or how she allocated her time. These changes were rarely announced. They were lived one decision at a time, often without drawing attention. At the same time, the language of church life began, in some places, to show signs of strain. Concepts that had once seemed straightforward, submission, modesty, duty, now required more explanation. Leaders found themselves clarifying what these terms meant in a changing world, sometimes emphasizing their spiritual dimension rather than their social application. This allowed for a certain degree of flexibility, but it also highlighted that interpretation was no longer automatic. One of the more subtle but significant developments during this period was the growing awareness of difference among women themselves. Earlier narratives had often presented a relatively unified image of womanhood, centered on a shared set of roles and expectations. By the early 1960s, it was becoming clearer that women's experiences varied widely, shaped by education, employment, family structure, and personal aspiration. This awareness did not dissolve existing norms, but it made them more difficult to present as universally applicable. Within church groups, this could lead to more varied conversations. A discussion about family life might include perspectives that did not fully align. A lesson about duty might prompt questions about how that duty was defined in different circumstances. These exchanges were often handled carefully, with an emphasis on maintaining harmony, but they introduced a new level of complexity into communal life. At the same time, practical realities continued to shape behavior. Economic pressures, though not always dramatic, influenced decisions about work and family roles. In some households, dual incomes became more common, even if this was not publicly emphasized. Women who worked outside the home brought different experiences back into their church communities, experiences that could not always be easily translated into existing frameworks. This interaction between lived experience and established teaching created a quiet but persistent form of negotiation. A woman might continue to affirm the values she had been taught, while also adapting them to fit her circumstances. She might speak in familiar language, but with a slightly altered meaning. Over time, these adaptations could accumulate, gradually reshaping the way those values were understood within the community. Another area where this negotiation became visible was in the concept of authority. While formal structures often remained unchanged, the way authority was exercised and received could shift. A husband might still be described as the head of the household, but decisions might increasingly be made through discussion rather than simple directive. A church leader might still hold official authority, but congregants might engage with his teachings in a more reflective, less purely deferential manner. These changes did not necessarily weaken the church's influence. In some cases, they made it more resilient, allowing it to adapt without losing its central role. But they also altered the nature of that influence. It became less about uniformity and more about interpretation, less about unquestioned acceptance and more about negotiated understanding. At the same time, not all responses were accommodating. In some communities, there was a clear effort to draw firmer boundaries. Teachings were presented with renewed emphasis, and deviations were addressed more directly. This could create a sense of clarity, but it could also heighten the awareness of difference. Women who found themselves at the edge of these boundaries might experience a sharper sense of tension, as their internal reflections came into contact with more explicit expectations. It is within this context that the idea of choice began to take on a new significance. Earlier patterns had often presented women's roles as natural or given, something to be accepted rather than selected. As alternative possibilities became more visible, even if only faintly, the notion that one might choose differently introduced a new dimension to everyday decisions. This did not mean that most women abandoned traditional roles. Many did not, but the awareness that these roles could be understood as choices, rather than inevitabilities, changed their meaning. This shift in meaning could be both liberating and unsettling. It offered a sense of agency, but it also introduced uncertainty. Decisions that had once been guided by clear expectations now required more personal judgment. The support of community remained important, but it was no longer the only reference point. A woman might find herself balancing multiple sources of guidance, each carrying its own authority. As these dynamics continued to develop, the relationship between church and broader society became more visibly interconnected. Ideas that had once remained outside the immediate life of the congregation began to enter more directly, whether through media, education, or personal experience. The boundary between inside and outside became more permeable, allowing influences to move in both directions. And it is here that the story begins to take on a new kind of momentum. Because once ideas begin to circulate more freely, they tend to gather strength. Conversations that start quietly can become more confident. Questions that are first asked privately can find echoes in public discussion. Patterns that seem stable can begin to shift more quickly than expected. By the mid-1960s, this process was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The questions that had once lingered at the edges were now moving closer to the center, not only within individual lives but within the collective awareness of church communities. The sense of quiet adaptation was giving way, in some places, to a more conscious engagement with change. And as that engagement deepened, it would begin to reshape not only how women lived within church structures, but how those structures themselves were understood, interpreted, and, in certain cases, gradually reimagined. And as that engagement deepened, it would begin to reshape not only how women lived within church structures, but how those structures themselves were understood, interpreted, and, in certain cases, gradually reimagined. What is striking about this period is that change did not arrive all at once, nor did it move in a single direction. Instead, it created a kind of layered reality within church life, where older expectations and newer interpretations existed side by side, sometimes blending, sometimes quietly conflicting. For many women, this meant learning how to move between these layers without fully abandoning either one. In practical terms, this often showed itself in how women spoke about their roles. The language of devotion and duty remained familiar, but it was increasingly paired with ideas of personal fulfillment and individual calling. A woman might still describe her work in the home as central and meaningful, while also expressing a desire for intellectual engagement or social involvement beyond it. These two perspectives did not always cancel each other out. Instead, they coexisted, creating a more complex sense of identity than earlier models had allowed. Church programs began to reflect this complexity, even if only subtly. Women's groups that had once focused almost exclusively on service and instruction might now include elements of discussion, reflection, and shared experience. Topics could expand beyond strictly domestic concerns to include education, community involvement, or broader social issues, though often framed in ways that remained consistent with the overall tone of the congregation. This expansion was not always deliberate. In many cases, it emerged from the interests and experiences of the women themselves. As they brought new questions into these spaces, the structure adapted in response. A meeting that began with a traditional lesson might gradually shift into a conversation about how that lesson applied to changing circumstances. Over time, these conversations could become a regular part of communal life, even if they remained carefully moderated. At the same time, leadership within churches faced a more complicated task. Maintaining continuity required clarity, but responding to change required flexibility. Some leaders approached this balance by emphasizing underlying principles rather than fixed roles. They spoke about values such as care, responsibility, and faithfulness, allowing for a broader interpretation of how those values might be expressed. Others maintained a more defined structure, reinforcing established patterns with the belief that stability depended on consistency. For women, navigating these differing approaches required a kind of attentiveness that went beyond simple obedience. It involved listening not only to what was said, but to how it was said, and to what was left open for interpretation. A statement about family life might carry different implications depending on context, tone, and the specific experiences of those hearing it. Understanding these nuances became an important part of participating in church life during this period. This attentiveness extended into everyday decisions. Choices about work, education, and family roles were no longer guided solely by a single, unified expectation. Instead, they were shaped by a combination of tradition, personal reflection, and emerging cultural influences. A woman might decide to pursue further education while still maintaining a strong commitment to her family and church. Another might choose to focus entirely on domestic life, but with a different sense of autonomy than previous generations had experienced. These variations did not necessarily disrupt the overall structure, but they introduced a greater degree of diversity within it. Church communities that had once appeared relatively uniform now contained a wider range of experiences, even if those differences were not always openly discussed. This diversity could enrich communal life, but it could also create moments of quiet tension as individuals navigated expectations that were no longer entirely consistent. One area where this tension became particularly visible was in the concept of authority within the home. While traditional models continued to emphasize a clear hierarchy, lived experience increasingly reflected negotiation and partnership. Decisions about finances, children's education, and daily routines were often made through discussion rather than simple directive. This did not necessarily alter the formal language of authority, but it changed how that authority was exercised in practice. For some women, this shift brought a greater sense of agency. They found ways to participate more fully in decision-making, to express their perspectives, and to shape the direction of their households. For others, the gap between formal expectation and lived reality could feel more difficult, particularly if the language of authority remained unchanged while the practice evolved. In these cases, the process of adjustment required careful balance, maintaining harmony while gradually expanding one's role. At the same time, the relationship between church and broader social movements became more visible. Discussions about civil rights, education, and social responsibility began to intersect with church teachings in new ways. While these topics were not always directly connected to questions of gender, they contributed to a broader atmosphere in which established structures were being reconsidered. The idea that social arrangements could be examined and, if necessary, reformed was becoming more widely accepted. Within this atmosphere, women's roles could no longer be treated as entirely separate from other areas of social change. The same habits of reflection and questioning that were applied to issues of justice and equality began, gradually, to touch on the organization of family and church life. This did not always lead to immediate conclusions, but it expanded the scope of what could be considered. It is important to note that this process did not unfold evenly across all communities. In some areas, change remained limited, and traditional structures continued with relatively little alteration. In others, the pace of adaptation was more noticeable, leading to more explicit conversations about the role of women within the church. These differences often reflected broader regional, cultural, and denominational variations, as well as the specific leadership within individual congregations. Even within a single community, experiences could vary widely. Two women sitting in the same pew might interpret the same message in different ways, shaped by their own histories and expectations. One might hear affirmation of a role she valued deeply, while another might hear a description that no longer fully matched her sense of self. This diversity of interpretation added a new layer to communal life, one that required a degree of mutual awareness and, at times, careful negotiation. As these patterns continued to develop, the idea of continuity itself began to take on a different meaning. Rather than simply preserving established forms, continuity increasingly involved adapting those forms to new circumstances. This could be seen in small adjustments, changes in program structure, variations in language, or shifts in emphasis, but it also reflected a deeper process of reinterpretation. For many women, this reinterpretation allowed for a more integrated sense of identity. They could remain connected to their faith and community while also engaging with new ideas and opportunities. This integration was not always easy, and it did not resolve all tensions, but it provided a framework for navigating a changing world without entirely abandoning familiar structures. At the same time, not all tensions could be resolved through adaptation alone. In some cases, differences in interpretation became more pronounced, leading to clearer distinctions between those who favored continuity and those who sought more substantial change. These distinctions did not always result in open conflict, but they did shape the direction of conversations within church communities. What becomes increasingly evident as we move through this period is that the influence of the church on women's lives was not diminishing in a simple or uniform way. Instead, it was being reconfigured. The forms of guidance, expectation, and community that had once operated with a high degree of consistency were becoming more varied, more dependent on interpretation, and more responsive to individual experience. And as this reconfiguration continued, it would begin to influence not only how women understood their roles, but how future generations would encounter those roles, setting the stage for a period in which the questions that had once been quietly negotiated would begin to be asked more openly, and in ways that would reach far beyond the boundaries of any single congregation. And as this reconfiguration continued, it would begin to influence not only how women understood their roles, but how future generations would encounter those roles, setting the stage for a period in which the questions that had once been quietly negotiated would begin to be asked more openly, and in ways that would reach far beyond the boundaries of any single congregation. What followed was not an immediate break with the past, but a gradual shift in where authority seemed to rest. In earlier decades, much of that authority had felt external, located in Scripture as interpreted by clergy, reinforced by community expectation, and stabilized by shared assumptions about family life. Now, without those external structures disappearing, there was a subtle but growing sense that authority also involved personal discernment. A woman was still expected to listen, but she was increasingly aware that she was also interpreting. This shift changed the texture of everyday decisions in ways that were not always obvious from the outside. A choice about how to raise a child, for example, might still be framed in familiar moral language, but the reasoning behind it could involve a broader set of considerations. Advice from a minister might be weighed alongside a book, a conversation with a friend, or personal experience. None of these sources fully replaced the others, but their coexistence altered the balance. In church settings, this often produced a quieter, more reflective kind of participation. Women who might once have accepted teachings without question were now more likely to engage with them internally, even if they did not express disagreement openly. A lesson might be absorbed but also examined. A principle might be affirmed but applied selectively. This did not necessarily weaken commitment, but it did make it more complex. One of the more interesting developments during this period was the way in which language began to stretch in order to accommodate these changes. Terms that had once carried a relatively fixed meaning, words like submission, helpfulness, or virtue, began to be used in slightly broader ways. A woman might interpret submission not as passive obedience, but as a form of mutual respect within marriage. Helpfulness might include contributions beyond the home. Virtue might be understood as integrity of character rather than strict conformity to a specific set of roles. These reinterpretations were often subtle enough to pass without immediate notice, yet significant enough to reshape experience over time. They allowed women to remain within the framework of their communities while also adjusting that framework to better reflect their own understanding of their lives. In this way, change did not always require confrontation. It could occur through redefinition. At the same time, the presence of more visible social movements began to create new points of reference. Conversations about equality, rights, and opportunity were becoming more prominent in the wider culture, and even when they were not directly addressed within church settings, they were difficult to ignore. A woman might hear these ideas discussed in a broader context and then return to her church community with a slightly altered perspective, even if she did not articulate it immediately. This interaction between internal reflection and external influence created a dynamic that was both gradual and cumulative. Each small shift in understanding made the next one slightly easier. Each moment of questioning opened the possibility of further examination. Over time, what had once been a largely uniform system of expectations became a more fluid landscape, shaped by both tradition and emerging interpretation. For some women, this fluidity brought a sense of possibility. It allowed them to imagine lives that included both commitment to their faith and a broader range of experiences. They could remain active in their church communities while also pursuing education, work, or personal interests that might previously have seemed out of reach. This did not necessarily resolve all tensions, but it expanded the sense of what was available. For others, the same fluidity could feel unsettling. The clarity that had once provided comfort was now less certain. Expectations that had once been straightforward required more interpretation. The responsibility for making sense of one's role shifted, at least in part, onto the individual. This could create a sense of instability, particularly for those who valued the security of established patterns. Church communities responded to these differing experiences in a variety of ways. Some embraced a more open approach, allowing for a wider range of expression within a shared framework of belief. Others emphasized continuity more strongly, seeking to preserve a clear sense of identity in the face of change. In many cases, both approaches could be found within the same community, existing in a kind of careful balance. What is important to notice is that, even as these changes unfolded, the underlying structures did not simply disappear. The influence of church on women's lives remained significant. It continued to shape routines, relationships, and expectations. But the nature of that influence was evolving. It was becoming less about uniformity and more about negotiation, less about a single defined role and more about a range of possible interpretations within a shared tradition. This evolution was particularly evident in the experiences of younger women coming of age during this period. They encountered a church that still carried the language of the 1950s, but they did so in a world that was beginning to speak differently. Their understanding of their roles was shaped not only by inherited expectations, but by the broader cultural conversation that was increasingly impossible to ignore. As a result, their relationship to church authority could be more exploratory. They might ask questions more openly, seek out different perspectives, or engage with teachings in a more analytical way. This did not necessarily lead to rejection, but it did change the nature of engagement. Faith became something to be understood as well as accepted, something to be lived with awareness rather than simply followed. At the same time, older generations continued to play a significant role in maintaining continuity. Their experiences, shaped by earlier decades, provided a reference point that anchored the community. The interaction between these generational perspectives added another layer to the evolving dynamic, as each group brought its own assumptions and expectations into shared spaces. In many ways, this period can be understood as one of transition not only in external structures, but in the internal experience of those living within them. The shift from certainty to reflection, from uniform expectation to negotiated understanding, altered how women experienced their own lives, even when outward patterns remained similar. And as these internal shifts continued to deepen, they began to prepare the ground for more visible forms of change. Changes that would soon move beyond quiet reinterpretation and into more explicit conversations about the place of women within church life itself. Conversations that would draw on both the accumulated experiences of the past and the emerging possibilities of the present. Conversations that would draw on both the accumulated experiences of the past and the emerging possibilities of the present. When those conversations began to surface more clearly, they rarely started with abstract arguments. They often began with specific, practical questions. Why could a woman organize nearly every aspect of church life, yet not speak from the pulpit? Why was her labor essential but her voice more limited? Why were certain responsibilities assumed to be naturally hers, while others were treated as inherently inappropriate? These questions were not always asked publicly at first, but they circulated more widely than they once had, moving through informal networks of conversation, letters, and shared reading. What made these questions particularly powerful was that they were grounded in lived experience. Women did not need to imagine inequality. They could observe it in the structure of their own communities. They could see the difference between the work they performed and the authority they were granted. They could feel the expectations placed upon them, even when those expectations were framed in positive or protective terms. As a result, the conversation began not as a rejection of faith, but as an attempt to reconcile belief with experience. Church leaders, in turn, faced a more direct form of engagement than in earlier years. Where once questions might have been absorbed quietly, they now required responses. Some leaders approached this with a willingness to explore, acknowledging that certain practices had developed within specific historical contexts and might be open to reconsideration. Others responded by reaffirming traditional interpretations more firmly, emphasizing continuity and the importance of maintaining established roles. This divergence in response created a more visible spectrum within church life. In some congregations, there was a cautious opening, space for discussion, for re-examination, for gradual adjustment. In others, there was a deliberate reinforcement of boundaries, a clear statement that certain roles and structures were not subject to change. Between these positions lay a range of intermediate approaches, each shaped by local culture, leadership, and the particular concerns of the community. For women, navigating this spectrum required not only reflection, but also discernment about where and how to engage. Some chose to raise questions openly, participating in discussions that could influence the direction of their communities. Others continued to work within existing structures, adapting them quietly through practice rather than argument. Still others found themselves in a more difficult position, aware of the questions but uncertain about how to express them without risking relationships that mattered deeply to them. At the same time, the broader cultural conversation about women's roles was becoming more organized and more visible. Ideas that had once circulated in limited forms were now being articulated more clearly, sometimes in ways that directly addressed the relationship between religion and gender. These ideas did not always align neatly with church teachings, and their presence introduced a new kind of comparison. A woman could now see not only how her life was structured, but how it might be structured differently. This comparison did not automatically lead to change, but it altered the context in which decisions were made. Remaining within traditional roles could now be experienced as a choice rather than an inevitability, and that distinction carried weight. It meant that commitment to a particular way of life involved a more active form of agreement, one that had to be understood and, in some cases, defended. Within church communities, this shift toward conscious choice began to influence how expectations were communicated. Rather than assuming automatic acceptance, leaders often found themselves explaining the reasoning behind established practices more carefully. This could deepen understanding, but it could also expose the assumptions underlying those practices, making them more open to examination. One area where this became particularly evident was in the interpretation of religious texts. Passages that had long been read in a certain way were now being revisited with fresh attention to context and meaning. Women who engaged in these discussions brought their own experiences to the process, asking how ancient teachings should be understood in a modern setting. This did not always lead to consensus, but it did expand the range of possible interpretations. In some cases, these interpretive efforts led to tangible changes. Women might take on new roles within church activities, participate more actively in decision-making processes, or contribute to discussions that had previously been limited. These changes were often incremental, but they marked a shift in how authority and participation were understood. At the same time, resistance remained a significant part of the landscape. For many within the church, the existing structure was not simply a matter of habit, but of conviction. It was seen as grounded in tradition, supported by Scripture, and essential to maintaining a coherent moral framework. From this perspective, changes to women's roles were not merely adjustments, but potential disruptions to a system that had provided stability for generations. This tension between adaptation and preservation did not resolve quickly. It created a period in which multiple approaches coexisted, sometimes within the same congregation. A woman might encounter encouragement in one context and limitation in another, navigating a path that required both awareness and flexibility. What is perhaps most striking is how much of this process remained rooted in ordinary experience. The larger debates were present, but they were filtered through daily life, through conversations after services, through decisions made at the kitchen table, through the quiet reflection that accompanied routine tasks. In this way, the transformation of women's roles within church life was not only a matter of public discourse, but of countless small moments in which individuals reconsidered what they had once taken for granted. As these moments accumulated, they began to shape not only individual lives, but the collective direction of church communities. Patterns that had once seemed fixed became more open to variation. Expectations that had once been uniform became more diverse. The influence of the church remained strong, but it was now interacting with a broader range of perspectives, creating a more dynamic and, at times, more uncertain environment. By the later 1960s, this dynamic was becoming increasingly visible. The questions that had once been quietly contained were now part of a wider conversation, one that extended beyond individual congregations and into the broader cultural landscape. The interaction between faith, tradition, and changing social expectations was no longer subtle, but something that required ongoing attention and engagement. And as this period of more open questioning continued to develop, it would begin to reshape not only the roles available to women within church life, but also the ways in which authority, tradition, and community themselves were understood, opening a new chapter in the relationship between belief and daily life that would continue to unfold in ways that few in the earlier decades could have fully anticipated. And as this period of more open questioning continued to develop, it would begin to reshape not only the roles available to women within church life, but also the ways in which authority, tradition, and community themselves were understood, opening a new chapter in the relationship between belief and daily life that would continue to unfold in ways that few in the earlier decades could have fully anticipated. What made this new chapter feel different was not simply the presence of disagreement, but the growing visibility of it. In earlier years, differences in interpretation could remain largely private, managed within families or small circles of trust. By the late 1960s, those differences were becoming part of collective awareness. A woman might realize that her questions were not isolated, that others were asking similar things, sometimes in slightly different language, but with a shared sense of unease or curiosity. This recognition had a quiet but powerful effect. It shifted the experience of questioning from something solitary to something relational. A thought that might once have been dismissed as personal uncertainty could now be understood as part of a broader pattern. That, in turn, made it easier to consider the possibility that the structure itself, rather than the individual, might be open to examination. Church gatherings began, in some places, to reflect this change more directly. Discussion groups, study sessions, and informal conversations took on a slightly different tone. Questions were not always answered immediately, and in some cases they were allowed to remain open. This did not mean that authority disappeared, but it did mean that it operated in a more visible dialogue with the experiences of those within the community. For many women, this shift introduced a new kind of participation. They were no longer only recipients of instruction, but contributors to the ongoing interpretation of their faith. This contribution did not always take the form of public speaking or formal leadership. Often it appeared in the shaping of conversations, in the questions asked, in the perspectives shared. Yet even in these quieter forms, it represented a change in how women related to the structures around them. At the same time, the emotional dimension of this transition should not be overlooked. For women who had built their identities within a particular understanding of faith and duty, the process of reconsideration could be deeply complex. It involved not only intellectual reflection, but also a negotiation with memory, loyalty, and a sense of belonging. To question a role was, in some cases, to question the framework through which one had understood one's own life. This complexity often produced a careful pace of change. Even when new ideas were acknowledged, they were integrated gradually, tested against existing values, and adapted to fit within a sense of continuity. A woman might adjust her understanding of one aspect of her role while maintaining others. She might adopt new practices in some areas of life while preserving familiar patterns in others. This selective integration allowed for movement without abrupt rupture. Yet the very act of selection marked a significant shift. It indicated that roles were no longer experienced as entirely given, but as something that could be shaped. This did not eliminate constraint, but it altered the relationship to it. A woman could now engage with expectations more actively, deciding how to interpret and apply them in her own life. Within church leadership, this shift often required a reevaluation of how guidance was offered. Teaching could no longer rely solely on repetition of established forms. It needed to address the questions that were emerging, even if only indirectly. In some cases, this led to a deeper exploration of theological ideas, an effort to connect traditional teachings with contemporary experience in a way that felt coherent and meaningful. In other cases, the response was more defensive, emphasizing clarity and consistency as a way of maintaining stability. These differing approaches could coexist within the same broader tradition, creating a varied landscape in which women encountered different forms of guidance depending on their specific community. What is particularly noteworthy is how these developments affected the next generation. Young women growing up during this period encountered a church that was no longer entirely uniform in its expectations. They saw examples of women who lived in different ways, who interpreted their roles with varying degrees of flexibility. This exposure expanded the range of possibilities that could be imagined, even if not all of those possibilities were equally supported. At the same time, these young women were still shaped by many of the same structures that had influenced earlier generations. The language of modesty, responsibility, and devotion remained present. The expectation of marriage and family life continued to hold significant weight. The difference lay not in the disappearance of these expectations, but in the awareness that they could be approached in more than one way. This awareness introduced a new dimension to the process of growing up within church communities. It required not only learning established teachings, but also navigating the differences between them. A young woman might observe how her mother approached her role, how other women in the congregation lived their lives, and how broader cultural messages presented alternative possibilities. From these observations, she would begin to form her own understanding, often blending elements from each source. In this way, the transformation of women's roles within church life became an intergenerational process. Each generation inherited a set of expectations, but also contributed to their reinterpretation. The result was a gradual evolution, shaped by countless individual decisions rather than a single defining moment. At the same time, the broader cultural context continued to exert influence. Conversations about gender, equality, and personal identity were becoming more prominent, and their impact could be felt even in communities that sought to maintain a degree of separation from them. Ideas moved through media, education, and personal relationships, creating a network of influence that extended beyond any one institution. Within this network, the church remained an important point of reference, but it was no longer the only one. Women engaged with multiple sources of meaning, drawing from tradition, personal experience, and emerging cultural frameworks. This multiplicity added depth to their understanding, but it also introduced complexity, requiring a continual process of reflection and adjustment. As this process unfolded, the structure of church life itself began, in some places, to show signs of more visible change. Roles that had once been clearly defined became more flexible. Opportunities for participation expanded, sometimes in small ways, sometimes more noticeably. These changes did not occur uniformly, but they indicated that the reconfiguration of women's roles was moving beyond interpretation into practice. Yet even as these practical changes appeared, they carried with them new questions. How far could adaptation go without altering the core identity of the community? What aspects of tradition were essential and which could be reshaped? How should differences in interpretation be managed within a shared space of belief? These questions did not have simple answers, and their presence ensured that the process of change would continue to unfold over time. What had once been a relatively stable system of expectations had become a dynamic landscape, shaped by interaction, reflection, and ongoing negotiation. And as this landscape continued to evolve, it would draw in not only those within the church, but also those observing from outside: scholars, writers, and participants in broader social movements, each bringing their own perspective to a transformation that was no longer confined to the quiet spaces where it had first begun, but was now becoming part of a much wider historical moment still in motion. And as this landscape continued to evolve, it would draw in not only those within the church, but also those observing from outside: scholars, writers, and participants in broader social movements, each bringing their own perspective to a transformation that was no longer confined to the quiet spaces where it had first begun, but was now becoming part of a much wider historical moment still in motion. What followed was a gradual shift in how the story of the 1950s itself was understood. For years, that earlier decade had been remembered as stable, orderly, even ideal. But now, as women reflected more openly on their own experiences, that image began to acquire a more layered quality. It was still recognized as a time of strong community and shared values, but it was also increasingly seen as a period in which certain expectations had been tightly defined, sometimes more tightly than many had consciously acknowledged at the time. This re-examination did not occur all at once. It unfolded through conversations, personal writing, and collective reflection. Women began to describe their earlier lives with a mixture of appreciation and critique. They could recognize the sense of belonging and purpose that church life had provided, while also articulating the limits it had imposed. This dual perspective added depth to the historical understanding of the period, moving beyond simple nostalgia or simple rejection. Within church communities, this reflective process sometimes took the form of storytelling. Older women shared their experiences with younger members, not only as examples to be followed, but as accounts to be considered. These stories often revealed the complexity of earlier expectations, showing how women had navigated them with creativity, resilience, and, at times quiet resistance. In listening to these accounts, younger women could see both the continuity of certain values and the possibility of interpreting them differently. At the same time, institutional memory began to shift. Churches that had once presented a relatively uniform narrative of their past now found themselves acknowledging variation. The role of women, once described in a singular way, was recognized as having been lived in multiple forms. This acknowledgement did not necessarily resolve ongoing debates, but it created space for a more nuanced understanding of how the past connected to the present point. One of the more subtle but important developments during this period was the way in which authority itself was discussed. Earlier language had often emphasized clarity and certainty, presenting teachings as stable and unchanging. As reflection deepened, some communities began to speak more openly about interpretation, about the role of historical context, and about the ways in which understanding could develop over time. This did not eliminate disagreement, but it provided a framework for engaging with it more thoughtfully. For women, this evolving conversation offered both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, it allowed for greater participation in shaping the life of the church. Their experiences, insights, and questions could contribute to a broader understanding of faith and practice. On the other hand, it required navigating a more complex environment, where expectations were less clearly defined and where different perspectives had to be balanced. This balance often played out in everyday interactions. A conversation about family roles might include references to tradition, personal experience, and contemporary ideas, all woven together in a way that reflected the diversity of the community. Decisions about participation in church activities might involve consideration of both established patterns and individual circumstances. In this way, the process of change was embedded in the ordinary rhythm of communal life. At the same time, the broader cultural context continued to influence the direction of these developments. Movements advocating for greater equality and expanded opportunities for women were becoming more organized and more visible. Their language and ideas entered public discourse with increasing clarity, and even when they were not fully embraced within church communities, they contributed to the environment in which those communities operated. This interaction created a kind of dialogue between different spheres of life. Church teachings and cultural movements did not exist in isolation from each other. They responded, directly or indirectly, to the same underlying questions about identity, responsibility, and the structure of society. For women who moved between these spheres, the process of making sense of their roles became an ongoing negotiation. One of the most significant aspects of this negotiation was the way it reshaped the idea of continuity. Rather than simply preserving the past, continuity began to involve a more active engagement with it. Traditions were not only maintained, but also examined, interpreted, and, in some cases, adapted. This did not mean that all aspects of church life were subject to change, but it did mean that change was no longer entirely external to the institution. As this perspective took hold, it influenced how future developments would be approached. Instead of seeing change as a disruption to be resisted or an inevitability to be accepted, some communities began to view it as a process to be guided. This approach allowed for a more deliberate engagement with emerging ideas, creating the possibility of shaping them in ways that remained connected to core values. For women, this shift opened new avenues for participation. Their voices could contribute not only to the interpretation of existing roles, but to the consideration of how those roles might evolve. This did not occur uniformly, and it did not eliminate all limitations, but it marked a significant step in the ongoing reconfiguration of their place within church life. At the same time, the emotional and relational dimensions of this process remained central. Changes in roles and expectations affected not only individuals, but also families and communities. Negotiating these changes required sensitivity to relationships that had been built over time, as well as a willingness to engage with differing perspectives in a constructive way. This emphasis on relationship helped to moderate the pace of change. Rather than moving rapidly in a single direction, many communities proceeded cautiously, balancing the desire for adaptation with the need for cohesion. This cautious approach could slow the process, but it also allowed for a more gradual integration of new ideas, reducing the risk of fragmentation. As the decades progressed, the cumulative effect of these developments became more apparent. The roles available to women within church life expanded in some areas, while remaining more constrained in others. The language used to describe those roles became more varied, reflecting a wider range of experiences and interpretations. The relationship between tradition and change became an ongoing conversation rather than a fixed position. And through all of this, the legacy of the 1950s continued to shape the present. The expectations, structures, and values of that earlier period did not disappear. They remained part of the foundation upon which later developments were built, but they were no longer experienced in the same way. They had become part of a larger, more complex story, one that included both continuity and transformation. As this story continued to unfold, it would draw in new voices, new experiences, and new questions, each adding another layer to the understanding of how church life had shaped and continued to shape the lives of women. An understanding that was still evolving, still being interpreted, and still moving forward into the next stage of its history. And as the story continued to unfold, it would draw in new voices, new experiences, and new questions, each adding another layer to the understanding of how church life had shaped and continued to shape the lives of women, an understanding that was still evolving, still being interpreted, and still moving forward into the next stage of its history. As this next stage began to take form, one of the more noticeable developments was not simply the expansion of roles, but the changing way those roles were justified. In earlier decades, expectations had often been explained through a sense of inherited order, something presented as settled, rooted in long-standing tradition. Now, increasingly, those same expectations were being discussed in terms that required explanation, context, and sometimes defense. This subtle shift from assumption to articulation marked an important change in how authority operated. For many women, this meant that the structure of church life became more visible in a new way. Practices that had once felt natural now appeared as choices that had been made at some point in the past. And once something is understood as a choice, even a historical one, it becomes easier to imagine that it could have been different or could be different again. This awareness did not necessarily produce immediate transformation, but it deepened the sense of engagement. A woman attending a service or participating in a church activity might now be aware not only of what was happening, but of why it was happening in that particular way. She might consider how certain roles had developed, how they were maintained, and how they related to broader patterns in society. This reflective layer added a quiet complexity to experiences that had once been more straightforward. At the same time, the presence of multiple interpretations within a single community became more normalized. Where earlier decades had often emphasized unity of perspective, later years saw a greater tolerance for variation, at least within certain limits. Women could hold slightly different views on their roles and still participate in the same shared practices. This did not eliminate tension, but it made it possible for communities to remain cohesive even as internal diversity increased. This cohesion, however, required ongoing negotiation. It depended on a shared willingness to balance differing perspectives without allowing them to fracture the sense of belonging. In many cases, this balance was maintained through an emphasis on common values, faith, care, community, while allowing some flexibility in how those values were expressed. For women, this meant that participation in church life could take on a wider range of forms, even if certain boundaries remained in place. One of the more interesting aspects of this period is how it reshaped the idea of influence. In earlier patterns, influence had often been closely tied to formal roles and visible authority. As the structure evolved, influence could also emerge through conversation, example, and interpretation. Women who engaged thoughtfully with the changing landscape could shape the direction of their communities, not necessarily by holding official positions, but by contributing to the way ideas were understood and applied. This form of influence was less visible but no less significant. It operated through relationships, through the gradual accumulation of shared understanding, and through the ways in which everyday practices were adapted. A change in how a group discussed a particular topic or how a family approached a decision could have ripple effects that extended beyond the immediate context. At the same time, the question of visibility itself became more prominent. As women's contributions expanded and diversified, there was a growing awareness of the difference between what was done and what was recognized. In some cases, this led to efforts to make women's roles more visible within the structure of the church, whether through expanded opportunities for leadership, participation in decision-making, or acknowledgement of the work that had long been performed behind the scenes. These efforts were not uniform, and they were not always fully realized, but they reflected a broader shift in perception. The idea that women's contributions were central to the life of the church was not new, but the recognition of those contributions in more explicit ways marked a departure from earlier patterns. At the same time, this movement toward visibility brought its own set of questions. How could expanded recognition be balanced with existing structures? What forms of participation were appropriate within a given tradition? How could change be integrated without disrupting the sense of continuity that many valued? These questions did not have simple answers, and they ensured that the process of adaptation would remain ongoing. For many women, navigating these questions required a careful balance between patience and initiative. Change often occurred gradually, through sustained engagement rather than sudden shifts. A woman might take on a new role, contribute to a discussion, or support a change in practice, all within the context of maintaining relationships and respecting the broader framework of the community. This gradual approach could be both effective and frustrating. It allowed for continuity and stability, but it also meant that progress could feel slow. The pace of change was shaped not only by ideas, but by the need to maintain cohesion within communities that valued unity. As a result, developments often unfolded over years rather than moments, building incrementally rather than dramatically. At the same time, the broader cultural environment continued to evolve, introducing new ideas and expectations that interacted with church life in complex ways. Women encountered these influences in education, in work, in media, and in social relationships, bringing them back into their communities as part of an ongoing conversation. This exchange ensured that church life remained connected to the wider world, even as it maintained its own distinct identity. What becomes increasingly clear as we follow this process is that the story is not one of simple decline or simple liberation. It is a story of transformation, shaped by both continuity and change, by both structure and agency. Women's lives within church communities were not defined by a single pattern, but by a range of experiences that evolved over time. And as these experiences continued to accumulate, they began to influence how future generations would understand both the past and the present. The 1950s, once seen as a stable reference point, became part of a more complex narrative, one that included both the strength of its communal structures and the limitations they imposed. As new generations looked back on that period, they did so with a perspective shaped by the changes that had followed. They could see the ways in which church life had provided meaning and connection, and also the ways in which it had constrained certain possibilities. This dual awareness allowed for a more nuanced engagement with tradition, one that neither dismissed it nor accepted it uncritically. And it is within this ongoing process of reflection and reinterpretation that the story continues to move forward, into a period where the questions that once emerged quietly within individual lives would become part of broader conversations about identity, authority, and the nature of community itself, conversations that were still unfolding, still being negotiated, and still shaping the path ahead. And it is within this ongoing process of reflection and reinterpretation that the story continues to move forward, into a period where the questions that once emerged quietly within individual lives would become part of broader conversations about identity, authority, and the nature of community itself, conversations that were still unfolding, still being negotiated, and still shaping the path ahead. As these broader conversations gained clarity, one of the most significant changes was not simply what women were allowed to do, but how openly those possibilities could be discussed. In earlier years, even when women adapted their roles in practice, the language surrounding those roles often remained fixed. Now, increasingly, the language itself began to shift. Words that once carried a single, stable meaning started to hold multiple interpretations, depending on who was speaking and in what context. This shift in language had a quiet but far-reaching effect. It allowed conversations that had once felt difficult or even unthinkable to take place with greater ease. A woman could ask what a particular expectation meant in her own life without immediately being seen as rejecting it. She could explore the boundaries of a role without necessarily stepping outside it. In this way, the conversation moved from whether change was possible to how it might be understood. At the same time, this openness introduced a new kind of complexity into church life. When meanings are shared and stable, community can rely on a certain predictability. When meanings begin to vary, that predictability becomes less certain. For many congregations, this meant learning how to live with a degree of ambiguity that had not previously been as visible. It required patience, attentiveness, and a willingness to engage with perspectives that might not fully align. For women, this environment created both opportunity and responsibility. The opportunity lay in the ability to shape their own understanding more actively, to engage with their faith in a way that felt personally meaningful. The responsibility lay in navigating that freedom in a way that maintained connection with the community. This balance was not always easy to achieve, and it often required careful judgment about when to speak, when to listen, and how to interpret what was being said. One of the more subtle developments during this time was the growing recognition of experience as a source of insight. Earlier patterns had often placed primary emphasis on established teaching, with personal experience seen as something to be guided by it. As conversations evolved, experience itself began to play a more visible role in shaping understanding. Women's accounts of their own lives, of work, family, faith, and daily responsibility, were increasingly seen as relevant to the interpretation of broader principles. This did not replace traditional sources of authority, but it complemented them in new ways. A teaching might still be presented in a familiar form, but it could be discussed in light of how it was lived. This interaction between principle and experience added depth to the conversation, allowing for a more nuanced understanding of how faith functioned in practice. Within church groups, this often took the form of shared reflection. Women would discuss how they navigated particular challenges, how they balanced responsibilities, how they understood their roles in changing circumstances. These discussions did not always lead to agreement, but they created a space in which different experiences could be acknowledged and considered. Over time, this contributed to a broader sense of what was possible within the community. At the same time, the presence of differing experiences made it more difficult to maintain a single, unified narrative about women's roles. The idea that there was one correct way to live out a particular expectation became harder to sustain when real lives demonstrated a range of approaches. This did not eliminate the desire for clarity, but it required a more flexible approach to achieving it. Another important development was the way in which time itself began to be understood differently. Earlier patterns had often emphasized continuity, the idea that roles and expectations remained stable across generations. As change became more visible, there was a growing awareness that time could bring development as well as preservation. Traditions were still valued, but they were also seen as part of an ongoing process rather than a fixed endpoint. For women, this meant that their own lives could be understood as part of a larger historical movement. They were not simply inheriting a set of roles, but participating in their evolution. This perspective did not necessarily make change easier, but it provided a context in which it could be understood as meaningful rather than disruptive. At the same time, the relationship between individual choice and communal expectation continued to evolve. As more options became visible, the act of choosing took on greater significance. A decision to follow a traditional path could now be experienced as an active commitment rather than a default. Similarly, a decision to interpret that path differently required a conscious engagement with both personal values and community norms. This emphasis on choice did not remove the influence of social pressure. Expectations remained powerful, and the desire for belonging continued to shape behavior. But the awareness of choice introduced a new dimension to how those expectations were experienced. It allowed women to consider their roles not only in terms of obligation, but in terms of meaning and alignment with their own understanding of their lives. Within church leadership, this shift often required a more dialogical approach. Teaching could no longer rely solely on assertion. It needed to engage with the questions and experiences of the congregation. This did not mean abandoning authority, but it did mean exercising it in a way that acknowledged the complexity of the environment. Leaders who were able to navigate this balance could foster a sense of continuity while also allowing for thoughtful adaptation. For some communities, this approach led to a gradual expansion of women's roles in visible ways. Opportunities for leadership, teaching, and participation in decision-making increased, though often within carefully defined boundaries. These changes were sometimes framed as natural developments rather than departures from tradition, allowing them to be integrated without creating a sense of rupture. In other communities, the response remained more cautious. The emphasis on established roles continued, and changes were limited or resisted. This divergence in approach contributed to a broader landscape in which women's experiences could vary significantly depending on their particular context. The same overarching tradition could produce very different forms of life, shaped by local interpretation and practice. What becomes increasingly clear is that the story of how churches influenced women's lives is not a simple narrative of control or release. It is a story of interaction between structure and agency, between tradition and change, between shared belief and individual experience. Each of these elements played a role in shaping the outcomes, and none operated in isolation. As this interaction continued, it created a sense of movement that was both gradual and persistent. Changes that began in small, almost unnoticed ways accumulated over time, influencing not only individual lives but the collective direction of communities. The process was not always smooth, and it did not follow a single path, but it carried forward a momentum that would continue to shape the relationship between women and church life in the years that followed. And as that momentum carried into the next phase, it would begin to bring even more explicit questions to the surface, questions not only about roles and expectations, but about the deeper assumptions that had supported them, questions that would require communities to engage not just with how women lived within the church, but with how the church understood itself in a changing world. And as that momentum carried into the next phase, it would begin to bring even more explicit questions to the surface, questions not only about roles and expectations, but about the deeper assumptions that had supported them, questions that would require communities to engage not just with how women lived within the church, but with how the church understood itself in a changing world. What began to emerge at this stage was a shift from asking how women should behave to asking why certain expectations existed at all. Earlier conversations had often focused on adjusting roles within an accepted framework. Now, increasingly, the framework itself became an object of reflection. This was a quieter kind of turning point, but a significant one. It marked the moment when the structure was no longer invisible. For many women, This shift did not come as a sudden realization, but as a gradual accumulation of small recognitions. A familiar teaching might be heard in a new way. A long-accepted practice might be viewed with a sense of distance, as though it belonged to a different time as much as to the present. These moments did not necessarily lead to immediate conclusions, but they created a space in which deeper questions could form. Within church communities, these questions often surfaced in careful, measured language. Rather than direct challenges, they appeared as inquiries into meaning and context. Why had a particular interpretation become dominant? How had it developed over time? What assumptions about society and family life had shaped it? These were not questions that could be answered quickly, and in many cases they led to further reflection rather than resolution. At the same time, the act of asking them altered the tone of participation. Women were no longer only engaging with what was presented. They were engaging with how it had been constructed. This introduced a new level of awareness into church life, one that could not easily be reversed. Once a system has been examined from the inside, it becomes difficult to return to experiencing it as entirely given. This did not mean that all women moved in the same direction. Some found that deeper examination strengthened their commitment to traditional interpretations, providing a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. Others found that it opened possibilities for rethinking certain aspects of their roles. Many occupied a space between these positions, holding elements of both continuity and change in a kind of careful balance. The presence of these different responses created a more complex communal environment. Conversations could no longer rely on a shared assumption of agreement. They required listening, interpretation, and sometimes a willingness to leave certain questions open. For communities that had long valued unity, this introduced a new challenge: how to maintain cohesion while allowing for diversity of thought. One way this challenge was addressed was through an increased emphasis on core principles rather than specific applications. Values such as compassion, integrity, and faithfulness were highlighted as common ground, even as their expression varied. This approach allowed for a degree of flexibility without abandoning a shared identity, but it also required a shift in how authority was understood. Authority became less about enforcing uniform practice and more about guiding interpretation. For women, this shift could be both empowering and demanding. It allowed for a more active role in shaping their own understanding, but it also placed greater responsibility on them to navigate complexity. The clarity of earlier expectations had provided a kind of security, even when it was restrictive. The new environment offered more room for agency, but also required more judgment. This change in responsibility was particularly evident in the way women approached decisions about their own lives. Choices about education, work, family, and participation in church activities were no longer framed solely by external expectation. They involved an internal process of reflection, in which personal values, community norms, and broader cultural influences all played a part. This process could be thoughtful and deliberate, but it could also be uncertain, as familiar guidelines became less definitive. At the same time, the broader social context continued to evolve, bringing new ideas into conversation with established beliefs. Discussions about equality, rights, and identity were becoming more prominent, and their influence could be felt even in communities that sought to maintain a degree of separation. These ideas did not always align with traditional teachings, but they provided additional perspectives that women could not easily ignore. This interaction between different sources of meaning created a kind of layered understanding. A woman might draw on her faith, her personal experience, and the broader cultural conversation informing her view of her role. These layers did not always fit together seamlessly, and navigating their tensions required ongoing reflection. But they also enriched the process, allowing for a more nuanced engagement with both tradition and change. Within church life, This layered understanding began to influence not only individual behavior, but also collective practice. Programs, discussions, and forms of participation gradually adapted to reflect a wider range of experiences. Women's contributions became more visible in some areas, and their perspectives more integrated into the life of the community. These changes were often incremental, but they indicated a shift in how the church related to the people within it. At the same time, the question of continuity remained central. For many within the church, preserving a sense of connection to the past was deeply important. Change was approached with caution, not only out of resistance, but out of a desire to maintain the integrity of a shared tradition. This tension between preservation and adaptation shaped the pace and direction of developments, ensuring that they unfolded over time rather than in sudden transformation. What becomes increasingly clear as we follow this process is that the influence of the church on women's lives was not diminishing in a simple sense. It was becoming more complex, more negotiated, and more intertwined with other sources of meaning. The structures that had once guided behavior in a relatively uniform way were now part of a broader conversation, one that included multiple perspectives and evolving interpretations. For the women living through this period, the experience was not defined by a single narrative. It involved moments of continuity and moments of change, moments of clarity and moments of uncertainty. It required balancing loyalty to a community with an awareness of personal experience, and navigating a path that was not always clearly marked. And as these experiences continued to shape both individual lives and collective practices, they laid the groundwork for further developments that would continue to explore the relationship between faith, authority, and the lived reality of women's lives, carrying the story forward into yet another phase of reflection and transformation still unfolding. And as these experiences continued to shape both individual lives and collective practices, they laid the groundwork for further developments that would continue to explore the relationship between faith, authority, and the lived reality of women's lives, carrying the story forward into yet another phase of reflection and transformation still unfolding. If we pause here, at the end of this long arc, what becomes most striking is not a single moment of change, but the quiet persistence of influence, and the equally quiet persistence of response. The churches of the 1950s did not control women's lives through force alone. They shaped them through rhythm, expectation, belonging, and meaning. They offered identity, stability, and moral purpose in a world that deeply valued order after years of disruption. For many women, that structure was not simply imposed. It was lived, believed, and, in many cases, sincerely embraced. But within that structure, there were always layers. There was the visible role, and then there was the lived experience beneath it. There were expectations that seemed clear, and then there were the small adjustments required to make them work in real life. There was the language of certainty, and then there was the quiet, ongoing process of interpretation. Over time, those layers began to shift. What looked like obedience often contained negotiation. What looked like stability often contained strain. What looked like uniformity often concealed variation. And perhaps most importantly, what looked like permanence was, in fact, something that could change, slowly, carefully, sometimes almost invisibly. By the 1960s and beyond, women were not simply stepping outside of church influence. Many were still deeply connected to it, but they were relating to it differently. They were asking questions more openly, interpreting teachings more actively, and shaping their roles with a greater awareness of choice. The system had not disappeared, but it had become visible. And once something becomes visible, it can no longer operate in quite the same way. For later generations looking back, the 1950s can seem distant, even strange in their level of social certainty. But for the women who lived within that world, it was not experienced as a fixed script. It was something they inhabited, adapted, and gradually reshaped, often without the language to describe what they were doing at the time. That is part of what makes this history so quietly powerful. It is not only the story of institutions shaping lives, but of lives, over time, reshaping institutions, through conversation, through reflection, through small decisions repeated day after day. And if there is a question that lingers gently at the end of it all, it might be this. When we think about the roles people are expected to live today, whether in family, in community, or in belief, how much of that feels natural, and how much has simply become familiar over time? If you found yourself thinking about that, or if there was a moment in this story that stayed with you, you're always welcome to share it. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, thoughtful journey through history, you can subscribe to find more stories like this, ones that take their time and let the past unfold slowly, just as it was lived.